I came to Christmas dinner with my hands full of carefully wrapped gifts, the smell of cinnamon and pine clinging to my coat as I stepped inside. But before I could even place them under the tree, my mother's voice sliced through the room like a knife, sharp and cruel. "You're a leech. Get out." The chatter around the table froze, forks hung midair, and every pair of eyes turned toward me. In that instant, the warmth of the season evaporated, replaced with a cold humiliation that burned hotter than any fireplace could. I had rehearsed cheerful greetings in my head, imagined laughter, maybe even a fragile sense of belonging, but instead I was standing there like an intruder, my mother's words echoing against the walls that once felt like home. My chest tightened, my throat dry, yet I refused to let my tears fall where she could see them. I forced myself to breathe slowly, memorizing the sight of their shocked faces, because I knew that moment would become a turning point I would never forget. And everything I did next would be carved into memory not just as a reaction, but as a choice that would change everything. I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time I saw not my mother, but a woman who had decided long ago that I would be her scapegoat, the one to carry every failure, every disappointment, every resentment she refused to claim as her own. My brother shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at me but not speaking. Because he never needed to. He was the golden child, the one she praised and protected at every cost, while I was the one told to be grateful for scraps. The tree glittered in the corner, presents piled high, most of them with his name on them, and I realized how perfectly symbolic it was. I had poured my savings into thoughtful gifts, carefully chosen for each person at this table, but my presence was the gift they rejected. "Did you hear me?" she snapped, as if I were deaf or stupid, her wine glass trembling just slightly in her hand, not from fear but from impatience. My father kept his eyes glued to his plate, cutting his ham into tiny bites as though if he stayed quiet enough, he might disappear. He had perfected that silence over decades, watching her tear me down, excusing it as her way, never lifting a finger to defend me. I wanted to scream, to throw the gifts down and storm out, but instead I steadied myself, because I realized that her cruelty was predictable, almost scripted. She had thrown those words at me before, in smaller ways, with barbs disguised as jokes at family gatherings, with comparisons that left me humiliated, with sighs of disappointment when I came home with good news that never seemed good enough. But this time it was public, undeniable, and in the middle of the one day of the year that was supposed to be about love and family. And as I stood there, holding my bag and my pride together with trembling fingers, I thought, if she wanted me gone so badly, then maybe leaving would be the most powerful gift I could give. Not to her, but to myself. So I turned quietly, without a word, and walked back to the door while the smell of roasted turkey and sweet potatoes clung bitterly to the air, a smell I used to associate with childhood magic but now only reminded me of exile. The silence behind me was deafening, broken only by my mother's satisfied exhale, as though she had finally proven something. My brother started to say my name, but she cut him off with a sharp glance, and I heard her voice, low and biting. "Don't defend her, she made her choices." My choices? I laughed bitterly under my breath as I reached for my coat. What choices had I ever been allowed to make in that house? Every path I had taken was shadowed by her constant reminder that I would never measure up, never be good enough, never deserve to sit comfortably at the same table as her perfect son. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my cheeks, the faint glow of Christmas lights strung across the street mocking me with their cheer. I sat in the car, staring at the steering wheel, my breath fogging the glass. 1,000 memories surged at once, years of cleaning up after family dinners while my brother lounged in front of the TV, years of being told to help out because I didn't have a real career worth bragging about, years of paying for groceries when my parents forgot their wallets, while still being called ungrateful. And here I was, on Christmas night, branded a parasite for daring to show up with gifts and hope. My hands trembled as I put the keys in the ignition, but beneath that tremor was something steady, something I hadn't felt in years. Resolve. This wasn't just about tonight. This was about a lifetime of being pushed down, and finally realizing that the only way to rise was to stop begging for a place at their table. I sat there, the engine humming softly, and thought, they expect me to go home and cry, to be broken, to return next year apologizing for being alive. But what if I didn't? What if this was the last time I ever allowed them to define me? What if I made a choice that none of them would see coming? I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the leather cold under my palms, and in that moment, I realized I wasn't just leaving dinner. I was leaving years of rehearsed humiliation behind. I thought about every Christmas past, the time I was 13 and saved my allowance to buy my mother a scarf, only to watch her toss it aside and gush over the designer bag my brother bought with her money. The time I baked cookies until 2 in the morning and she told me they were dry in front of everyone. The year I showed up with a boyfriend and she whispered to him, loud enough for me to hear, that he deserved someone with more ambition. It wasn't just tonight. It was the accumulation of every cut, every jab, every dismissal that had stacked up until I was buried in them. I sat in the car, headlights casting 2 pale beams into the dark street, and I asked myself, what kind of person willingly keeps walking back into the fire just because it's called family? I had given them my loyalty, my money, my time, even my silence, hoping it would buy me love. It never did. They liked me quiet, small, apologetic, and yet here I was, feeling a strange calm in my chest, because for the first time I understood that leaving wasn't weakness. It was the only power I had left. I thought about all the things they had borrowed over the years and never returned, the debt they pretended not to owe me, the way my brother's successes were built on opportunities I was denied. They thought I was powerless, a leech, someone clinging to scraps. But in reality, they had been feeding off me for years, and I had the receipts, bank transfers, texts, emails asking for help. I started the car, the engine roaring louder now, and whispered to myself, enough. The road stretched ahead, silent and endless, and I knew this wasn't just a drive away from a house, it was a drive toward something else. Toward the part of me that had been waiting all along to say, I don't need you, and I never will again. I pulled out of the driveway slowly, the tires crunching over the thin layer of ice, and glanced back once at the house glowing with warm lights, silhouettes moving inside as if nothing had happened. They would go on with dinner, laughing, pouring wine, pretending I never came. That was the story they would tell themselves, that I was too fragile, too dramatic, too ungrateful to handle the truth. But as I turned onto the empty road, the decorations twinkling faintly from neighbors' windows, I understood that the truth was simpler. They couldn't stand the mirror I held up to them. I was the proof that their love had conditions, that their family unity was a performance for others, that cruelty had always been their favorite holiday tradition. I drove aimlessly at first, past streets I knew by heart, the same ones I had walked as a child clutching mittens and hot cocoa, believing this neighborhood was safe, believing home was sanctuary. Now it was a stage, and I had finally stepped off it. The more I thought, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about walking away, it was about rewriting everything. For years they called me a leech, but who was really draining who? My bank statements told a different story. Rent payments I covered just until next month. Credit cards maxed in my name. Loans that were never repaid. Gifts that were demanded, not appreciated. I wasn't the parasite, they were. And for once, I wasn't going to swallow their narrative. My phone buzzed with a text from my brother. Mom didn't mean it. Come back, don't ruin the night. I laughed out loud, the sound bitter in the small car. He didn't even realize the irony. He wanted me back so their night wouldn't be ruined, not because I mattered. They weren't worried about me, only about appearances, about gossip, about how to explain my absence if anyone asked. I turned the phone face down and pressed harder on the gas. They thought I would crumble. They thought I would crawl back. But I wasn't heading home to cry into my pillow. I was heading somewhere else, somewhere they couldn't touch, because I had finally made a decision. This time I wouldn't just walk away quietly. This time I would show them exactly what happens when the scapegoat stops playing her role. I drove until the highway opened wide before me. black asphalt shimmering faintly under the streetlights, and for the first time in years I felt the air in my lungs expand without the weight of their judgment pressing it down. My mind raced faster than the car. Images of every overdraft fee I'd covered for them, every gift I'd bought that was met with indifference, every hour I'd spent cleaning up their messes, financial or emotional. I remembered when my mother used my credit card to order just a few things online and racked up nearly $2,000, then laughed when I confronted her saying, "Well, you should be grateful I trust you enough to use it." Grateful. That word had become a prison. Grateful for being belittled. Grateful for being used. Grateful for being tolerated in a family that never loved me the way I deserved. I realized then that I wasn't just driving away. I was driving toward the truth that had always been buried under their lies. I had power. Quiet, documented, undeniable power. Bank transfers, loan agreements, text messages where they promised repayment, even a signed check my brother never cashed, but claimed he did. They had no idea I had kept it all. They thought I was naive, disorganized, too desperate for their approval to ever fight back. They were wrong. My hands no longer shook. They were steady as I held the wheel, steady like the resolve building in my chest. This wasn't about revenge in the way they'd expect. It wasn't screaming, slamming doors, or begging to be heard. It was colder, sharper. It was the simple act of showing them the mirror they avoided for decades. I could already picture my mother's face when she realized her words tonight weren't the end of me, but the beginning of something she could never control. I whispered into the empty car, "You called me a leech, but you'll learn what it feels like when the one you drain finally cuts the cord." And for the first time in my life, I felt free, not because they had released me, but because I had released myself. The highway stretched endlessly, and with each mile I put between myself and that house, my memories began to rearrange themselves, not as wounds, but as evidence. I remembered the time my parents borrowed my savings when I was 22, telling me it was just until Dad's bonus cleared. The bonus never came, and when I asked about it later, my mother scoffed, "Money comes and goes, stop being petty." Petty, because I wanted back the nest egg I'd built working double shifts. Then at 25, when my car broke down, they told me I should have managed my money better, forgetting the thousands I'd handed them quietly, believing it was family duty. By 30, I was drowning in debt from loans I co-signed for my brother, loans he bragged about never repaying. Yet still, at every family gathering, I was painted as the irresponsible one, the failure, the burden. Their cruelty wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. If they convinced me I was worthless, I'd never realize how much they were taking. And tonight, when my mother called me a leech in front of everyone, she exposed the script she'd been running all along. Only this time I wasn't playing the part. I wasn't broken. I wasn't desperate to stay. I was finally awake. I pulled into a quiet rest stop, the lot nearly empty, and parked beneath a flickering streetlight. My hands itched to pull out my phone, to scroll through the folders I had carefully built over the years. Screenshots, receipts, copies of checks, even voice recordings of my mother admitting she borrowed from me because you don't need as much as your brother. Every bit of it was tucked safely into cloud storage, untouchable, undeniable. I sat there breathing hard, my heart pounding not with fear but with clarity. They wanted me erased, forgotten, humiliated. But I held the truth, and the truth had weight. I thought about what it would feel like to finally let that truth out, to show the world, or maybe just the right people, exactly who the real leeches were. The power wasn't in screaming back across that dinner table. It was in the silence I carried with me now. The silence full of evidence, ready to speak louder than they ever imagined. I leaned back in the driver's seat, the hum of the engine fading as I switched it off, the silence wrapping around me like armor. I stared up at the dark sky, stars barely visible through the haze, and I thought about how many years I had begged for scraps of love when all along I was the one keeping them afloat. I remembered Christmas mornings when I'd sit on the floor, unwrapping a single sweater while my brother drowned in electronics, vacations, gifts with price tags I couldn't dream of affording, and my mother would beam at him saying, He's going places. Meanwhile, I was expected to smile, to clap, to make myself small so the golden child could shine. And when I dared to ask why, she would tilt her head, mocking pity in her eyes, and say, "You should be grateful we even invite you." That word again, grateful. It wasn't gratitude they wanted. It was submission. They needed me to keep believing I was less so they could keep taking more. But now, sitting in the stillness, I realized they had underestimated me. Every insult, every dismissal, every time they called me weak had only made me sharper, more observant. While they were busy drinking their wine and praising each other, I had been documenting everything. And tonight, when she called me a leech, she revealed the fear behind her cruelty, that I might one day stop feeding them. I pulled my phone from my bag, opened the folder labeled simply Family, and scrolled. Bank transfers with notes like "Thanks again" and "We'll pay you back soon." Screenshots of late-night texts asking me to cover bills, just this once. Even my father's signature on a promissory note he thought I'd thrown away. My chest tightened, but this time it wasn't from shame. It was from the knowledge that I had leverage. They had stolen my dignity in front of that table, but I held the kind of truth that could strip theirs away permanently. For years, they had convinced me I was powerless. But the evidence in my hands told another story. I had been the one holding them up, and I could just as easily let them fall. The glow of my phone screen lit up the car, casting pale light across my face as I scrolled deeper into the archive I had built without even realizing what it would someday mean. There it was. The screenshot of my mother's message where she admitted to using my account to pay off her credit card balance because family doesn't keep score. Another, from my brother, bragging about flying first class on points he never earned. Points tied to my account after he'd convinced me to add him just to help him build credit. The receipts stretched back years, like a trail of breadcrumbs no one thought I'd ever follow. And maybe once they would have been right. But tonight, sitting in this car after being called a parasite in front of a glowing Christmas tree, I realized the irony. They had always been feeding off me, and now I had the proof to show it. My fingers hovered over the share button, the temptation sharp and thrilling. I could send it all to my aunt, the one who always suspected but never had the courage to ask. I could forward it to my cousin, who idolized my brother, or to the bank officer who had once hinted that my credit file looked odd. I could even drop it all online, one neat package of truth. But I didn't, not yet. Power wasn't about impulsive moves. It was about patience, timing, control. For the first time in my life, I had control. I wasn't the girl begging at their table anymore. I was the woman sitting in the dark, holding the match that could burn down the house of lies they had built. The realization sent a shiver down my spine, but it wasn't fear, it was liberation. They thought tonight was about humiliating me, driving me away in shame. What they didn't know was that tonight was the night I stopped playing their game. I didn't just leave Christmas dinner. I left their script behind, and now I was writing my own. The streetlight above me flickered, buzzing faintly, as if the world itself was holding its breath while I pieced together decades of buried truth. I remembered being 12, watching my mother pull me aside after a family gathering to hiss, "Smile wider, you make us look bad." I remembered being 17, when my acceptance letter to a state university was brushed off as nothing special, while my brother's mediocre internship at a local bank was treated like a royal coronation. By 20, I had been trained to believe that love meant sacrifice, my sacrifice, their comfort. And yet, despite everything, I kept showing up year after year, thinking maybe this time would be different. Maybe this Christmas, maybe this birthday, maybe this wedding anniversary, they would see me. Tonight had shattered that illusion completely, but instead of grief, I felt clarity. My whole life I had been cast as the leech, the dependent, the problem. But the documents glowing on my screen told a different story. Thousands funneled out of my account, bills paid in my name, debts absorbed without thanks. I was the provider, the silent engine running their carefully polished lives. They wore the masks of respectability, but the foundation was built on my labor, my credit, my silence. And silence was something I no longer owed them. I could already imagine how it would unravel. My mother, so proud of her social circle, so obsessed with appearances, watching as whispers spread that she'd been living off the daughter she humiliated. My brother, forever the golden child, forced to explain how his success was bankrolled by the sister he mocked. My father, quiet in the corner, realizing too late that his silence had tied him to their downfall. I didn't need to scream at the dinner table to get justice. Justice was already sitting neatly in folders, time-stamped and undeniable. The thought steadied me, warmed me even as the December wind rattled the car windows. I wasn't driving away in defeat. I was driving away with the story they had tried to bury, and the best part was, they had handed me every piece themselves. The irony was almost poetic. They called me a leech, but I was the one who had been bled dry. And now, for the first time, they would learn what happens when the supply is cut off and the truth is finally allowed to speak. I sat there with my phone balanced in my hand, the screen dimming, the battery almost dead, and I realized how perfectly fitting it was because for years, that was me, drained, dim, nearly empty, still trying to shine enough to be noticed. But not anymore. I plugged the phone into the charger, watching it flicker back to life, and with it came a calm unlike anything I'd felt before. This wasn't rage. It wasn't grief. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally see your parents not as gods or protectors, but as flawed people who built their comfort on your back. I thought about every whispered conversation where my mother told my brother, "Don't worry, she'll help. She always does." I thought about the times my father handed me bills with his eyes averted, murmuring, "Just until payday," a payday that never came. And I thought about how tonight they had pushed me too far by turning my private humiliation into public spectacle. They expected me to leave crushed, to cry, to retreat until I begged for re-entry into their lives. But instead, I was leaving with a decision that shifted the balance forever. I opened an email draft, attached a set of files, and addressed it only to myself. Proof that I was ready, that I could release it whenever I chose. Not tonight, not in haste, but soon, when the timing would cut the deepest. Because revenge wasn't about screaming in their faces, it was about letting the truth speak when they least expected it, when the performance they valued most was in full swing. I pictured it clearly, a family gathering, another party where they toasted my brother's success, and then the quiet unraveling as someone asked about the documents, the debts, the undeniable proof of who had really been carrying them all along. That vision steadied me like a lighthouse in the fog. They thought I had left in shame, but in reality, I had walked away carrying every ounce of power they had stolen, and I wasn't afraid to use it. The girl who showed up to Christmas dinner hoping for love was gone. The woman who drove away that night carried something far stronger than their approval. She carried the truth, and she was no longer afraid to use it. The hum of trucks passing on the highway in the distance filled the silence, and I let the sound settle in my bones like a reminder that the world was bigger than that dining room, bigger than their voices trying to cage me. I thought about how many times I had rehearsed comebacks in my head, sharp little speeches I would deliver if only I had the courage. But tonight showed me that silence was sharper than any words I could have thrown back across the table. Silence with evidence. Silence with action waiting behind it. I remembered the Christmas when I was 27 and gave my parents an envelope with cash. $2,000 I had scraped together from overtime shifts. Because they said they couldn't cover the mortgage. They hugged me, thanked me, and then the next morning my mother laughed on the phone with her sister about how our daughter finally did something useful. Useful. That was all I had ever been to them. Not loved, not cherished, just useful. But useful can turn dangerous when the one being used wakes up. I looked at the list of transactions again and felt a strange satisfaction in the neatness of it. Dates, amounts, notes, all aligning into a story they could no longer deny. It wasn't messy emotion anymore. It was hard fact, facts that could slice through every lie they had ever told about me being a leech. Facts that could turn every chuckle at my expense into a weapon that cut back at them. My phone buzzed again, this time a call from my father. I watched it ring, the name glowing on the screen, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel the urge to answer. I let it go to voicemail because I already knew what he would say. Don't be dramatic. Come back. Your mother didn't mean it. But she did mean it. She always meant it. And tonight she finally said it out loud. That truth freed me. I wasn't coming back. Not tonight, not next year, not ever in the way they expected. They thought they had banished me, but in reality I had walked out carrying the story that would undo them if I chose. And for the first time, I understood the deepest form of revenge wasn't noise. It was control, and I had it in my hands. I let the phone fall silent, the missed call icon glowing briefly before fading, and in that small act I felt something I had never felt in that house. Authority. They could no longer summon me with a word, no longer twist my guilt into obedience. I sat there remembering the countless times I had been told I was too emotional, too fragile, too dependent. Labels thrown at me until I wore them like skin. But in the quiet of that car, I stripped them off one by one, exposing the truth underneath. I had been the one holding everything together. When Dad's car broke down, it was my loaner they drove for 3 months. When Mom wanted to throw a dinner party, it was my paycheck that stocked her fridge. When my brother's rent was overdue, it was my transfer that kept his lights on. And now they had the audacity to call me a leech. My lips curved into the faintest smile, not of joy but of recognition, because I finally saw them clearly. Parasites dressed as benefactors, users disguised as family, and me, the scapegoat, finally standing outside their performance. I opened the glove compartment and pulled out a worn notebook, one I had kept hidden for years, where I had written down every favor, every dollar, every slight. Not to obsess, but to survive. To remind myself I wasn't crazy, that their rewriting of the past wasn't the only truth. Flipping through the pages, I felt strength rising with every line. I wasn't just armed with receipts on a phone. I carried years of lived evidence carved in ink, undeniable. They thought cutting me off from their table was punishment, but in reality it was permission. Permission to walk away, to stop feeding a machine designed to erase me. I whispered into the dark, my voice steady. You'll miss me. Not because I was weak, but because I was the one who kept you standing. The words settled like a promise, heavier than any argument I could have shouted back at them. And as I started the car again, merging back onto the highway, I felt it. Tonight wasn't the night I lost my family. It was the night I finally reclaimed myself. The road stretched out before me, long and endless, a black ribbon lit only by the faint glow of headlights and the scattered sparkle of Christmas lights from passing houses. Families were gathered inside those homes, laughter spilling out through frosted windows, tables crowded with food and warmth. For a moment, a sharp ache pierced me, an ache for the life I had always wanted, the kind of family that celebrated your presence instead of mocking it. But the ache passed quickly, replaced by something stronger, heavier, resolve. My family was never going to be that. They never had been. They thrived on tearing me down, on using me as their excuse, their scapegoat, their resource to drain when things got hard. Tonight only confirmed what I had always known, but never admitted. They would never change. And the power I had now wasn't in hoping they would treat me better someday. It was in knowing I didn't need them anymore. I thought of my mother's smirk as she said the word leech, her satisfaction at humiliating me in front of everyone. I thought of my father's silence, his cowardice dressed up as neutrality. I thought of my brother's text, more worried about appearances than about me. And then I thought of the evidence I carried, records they couldn't erase, truths they couldn't hide behind smiles and wine glasses. For years they had counted on my silence. But silence can turn into strategy. Silence can turn into power. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, and in my chest, instead of fear, there was fire. They wanted me gone? Fine. I would give them exactly what they asked for, but not as a broken daughter crawling back for scraps. I would vanish on my own terms, leaving behind a trail of truth that could topple every lie they told about me. They thought tonight was victory. What they didn't realize was that tonight was only the beginning of their unraveling. The miles ticked by, each exit sign flashing past like a marker of distance, not just from their house, but from the version of me who once sat obediently at that table, waiting for crumbs of approval. My phone buzzed again, this time a voicemail from my mother. I didn't need to listen. I could already imagine her tone, that syrupy false sweetness she used when she wanted to reel me back in. She would frame herself as the victim. You overreacted, you embarrassed us, you always twist things. That was her way of rewriting history, turning her cruelty into my fault. But for the first time, I didn't feel the need to defend myself, to explain, to argue. Let her spin her story. Mine was already written in proof, not words. I thought about every time she had told relatives that I was struggling, painting me as weak so they wouldn't question why I was never praised, why I was never supported. Meanwhile, I was the one making sure the lights stayed on, the bills got paid, the house didn't crumble. She needed me small so she could feel big. But tonight I had taken back my size. I wasn't her shadow anymore. I was the one carrying the spotlight she feared most. The truth. As the road curved into darkness, I whispered to myself the words I had never dared to say out loud at their table. I am not your leech. You are mine. The phrase lingered in the air, heavy, undeniable. I let it repeat in my mind like a mantra, stronger with every breath. They had fed on me for years, but that chapter was closed. My revenge wouldn't come with screaming or slammed doors. It would come with quiet detachment, with evidence waiting in folders, with the slow realization that the daughter they called useless had always been the one holding their world together. And when it fell apart, they would finally understand what it meant to be without me. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, and with every mile the knot in my chest loosened, replaced by something vast and steady. For years I had driven this same road back and forth to their house, always rehearsing apologies in my head, always trying to find the right words that might finally earn me a place at their table. Tonight, I realized there were no words that could fix it, because the truth was, they didn't want me whole. They wanted me desperate. I thought about the way my mother used to introduce me at parties. Her arm looped casually through mine, her smile sharp as glass. This is my daughter. She hasn't quite found her path yet. She said it when I was 22 with 2 jobs. She said it when I was 29 managing a team of 10. She said it when I was 32 paying her mortgage behind the scenes. To her, I was always unfinished, always a disappointment, because acknowledging my strength would mean admitting how much she depended on it. My father wasn't better. He wrapped his cowardice in politeness, always telling me, don't start anything, don't make waves. He never stopped her, never defended me, because his comfort mattered more than my dignity. And my brother, the golden child, he thrived on the imbalance, accepting every gift, every bailout, every sacrifice, then turning around and calling me dramatic when I dared to ask for even a fraction of recognition. They all played their parts in keeping me small, and yet here I was, the one they said was weak, holding the kind of power they could never imagine. I thought about the folder of evidence, every screenshot, every transfer, every note. It wasn't just numbers, it was my life story told in the language they couldn't refute, money. For decades, they had weaponized words to cut me down. Now I held the receipts that turned those words into lies. I could already imagine the ripple effect if I chose to let it out. The way my mother's friends would whisper, the way my brother's colleagues would look at him differently, the way my father would have to face the silence he had cultivated for so long. But the beauty was, I didn't have to unleash it all at once. The threat itself was power. Knowing I could speak at any time, that I wasn't bound by their script anymore, was enough to make my chest feel lighter than it had in years. As I drove, the thought settled over me. I didn't need their table. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their version of family. My life could finally be mine and theirs. Well, theirs would crumble under the weight of the truth they had built their empire of lies upon. And when it did, I wouldn't have to lift a finger. I would just watch, steady and silent, the way they had watched me suffer, except I would feel no guilt. Only freedom. The night swallowed the road as I drove deeper into the dark. The radio off. The only sound the steady thrum of the tires rolling beneath me. And in that silence everything sharpened. Every memory that had once left me shaken now stood in front of me like exhibits in a courtroom. Undeniable, arranged, ready. I thought back to being 19, coming home from my first apartment with bags of groceries because my mother had called crying about an empty fridge. I thought of the way she hugged me at the door, sobbing into my shoulder, before telling my aunt later that she pitied me for struggling to keep up. I thought about being 25, when I got my first promotion and treated the whole family to dinner. My brother toasted himself, telling the table how proud he was of his success, while my parents nodded approvingly, ignoring the fact that it was my paycheck paying the bill. I thought about being 30 when they forgot to invite me on a family trip, only to text me from the airport asking if I could send them a quick transfer because their card was acting up. That was the pattern. Use me, erase me, repeat. And I accepted it, year after year, convincing myself that maybe if I just gave a little more, they would see me. But tonight ended that lie. Tonight, my mother's voice had cut through every illusion. "You're a leech." "Get out," she thought she was defining me. In reality, she had defined herself. The word hung in the air like a brand, but it wasn't mine to carry anymore. It was theirs. Because I was the one they drained, over and over, until I nearly believed it. The truth was in the numbers, not in her cruelty. My cloud storage held more than evidence. It held liberation. Screenshots of desperate late-night pleas for money. Bank transfers marked "Don't tell Dad." My brother's smug texts bragging about trips I had unknowingly paid for. Even voice notes from my mother, thanking me in one breath, calling me a disappointment in the next. They had left fingerprints on every lie they told about me. And for once, I didn't feel the urge to confront them, to scream, to throw it all in their faces. That's what they expected. Drama, noise, another scene they could point to and say, "See? She's unstable." No, my revenge would be quieter, cleaner, sharper. It would be the silence that followed when their friends asked questions they couldn't answer. It would be the way my brother's confidence cracked when someone mentioned the loans in my name. It would be the look on my mother's face when the facade she polished so carefully crumbled in public. And the best part? I didn't even have to rush. I could choose the time, the place, the moment they least expected. I felt that freedom surge through me as the road stretched farther, each mile marker a symbol of the life I was leaving behind. They had stolen my childhood, my dignity, my peace, but they would never steal my truth. And the truth, when it came out, would cut deeper than any insult they had ever thrown. They thought they had exiled me from family. What they didn't realize was that I had exiled them from the one thing they valued most: control. And now, as the night carried me forward, I felt something I had never felt before. Not fear, not grief, but victory, raw and undeniable, pulsing through every beat of my heart. The miles blurred together, headlights carving twin paths through the dark, and with every stretch of road I felt the weight of decades peeling off me like old skin. I thought about the stories they told behind my back, the way they twisted my life into something pitiful for their audience. My mother, lowering her voice at church luncheons to sigh, "She's always struggling, bless her heart," while wearing a dress I had bought her for her birthday. My father, telling coworkers that his son was the pride of his life, while the car his son drove was in my name, my payments, my insurance. My brother, laughing with friends about how I was so gullible while I worked overtime to cover the rent he pretended to pay. They had stolen not just money, but narrative, rewriting me as the weak one, the failure, while leaning on me like I was their hidden foundation. And all this time I had played along, desperate for crumbs of approval, afraid that without them I was nothing. But tonight, sitting in my car, the December air icy around me, I realized the truth was the opposite. Without me, they were nothing. My mother's rage had never been about me being a leech. It was about her fear of being exposed as one. She knew, even if she never admitted it, that I was the one holding the fragile illusion together. She could mock me, belittle me, exile me, but she couldn't erase the truth that I carried in files, in bank records, in memories that no amount of gaslighting could scrub away. I imagined what it would look like, the slow unraveling. Maybe it would start with a slip at a neighborhood gathering, when someone innocently asked about the loan they had forgotten, or the credit card statement that didn't add up. Maybe it would be my brother's girlfriend stumbling across proof that his vacations were funded by his sister, not his job. Maybe it would be my father finally facing the silence of a wife who couldn't charm her way out of receipts. I didn't need to plan the exact moment. It would happen naturally because lies always collapse under their own weight once the truth is given air. And I held enough truth to suffocate them. The car heater hummed softly, fogging the windows, and I stared at my reflection in the glass. For the first time, I didn't see the girl desperate for her mother's approval. I didn't see the scapegoat, the punchline, the so-called leech. I saw a woman who had been used like currency and finally realized she was the one holding the ledger. The irony wasn't lost on me. All those years they called me a burden, when in reality I was their lifeline. They thought cutting me out tonight was punishment, but it was deliverance, for me, and eventually, punishment for them. Because when the truth seeped out, it wouldn't just sting. It would stain, permanently, marking them for what they really were. And I wouldn't even need to lift a finger. All I had to do was step aside and let their empire of lies collapse under its own rotten weight. As the night deepened, I felt it settle in my chest. The kind of calm that comes when you stop asking to be loved by those incapable of giving love. They thought I drove away defeated. In reality, I was driving toward freedom and the power to let the truth finally do what it had always been waiting to do: burn. The night grew quieter as I pushed farther down the empty stretch of road, the hum of the tires steady, hypnotic, like a drumbeat to my own awakening. My phone buzzed again, lighting up the console, and I saw a string of messages flooding in. My mother's sharp words softening into pleas. My brother's irritation bleeding through in half-hearted apologies. My father's silence broken by a single line. "Come back, let's talk this through." I stared at the screen, watching the words stack on top of each other, each one an echo of the same pattern I had lived for years. They wound, then they demand, then they rewrite, always pulling me back into their orbit with the promise that maybe this time things would change. But I knew better now. I let the messages pile up, unanswered, because what they didn't understand was that I no longer needed them to hear me. I needed them to feel the silence I had carried all my life. That silence, now deliberate, was heavier than anything I could say. I thought about the ledger in my glove compartment, the files on my phone, the receipts that mapped out every instance of my generosity twisted into shame. And I realized the true revenge wasn't in detonating it all at once. It was in the choice. I had the power to expose them tomorrow or next year or never at all. I could let them live in fear of when the curtain might be pulled back, always guessing, never secure. That uncertainty was my gift to them, the mirror image of the uncertainty they had forced me to live in every time I wondered if this would be the year I was finally enough. As the car cut through the dark, I pictured my mother's face when she realized she no longer had control over the narrative, when she sensed the shift that she couldn't explain away to her friends. I pictured my brother stumbling under the weight of his own lies when his success was questioned and the truth clawed its way to the surface. I pictured my father, finally forced to look up from his plate, realizing that his silence had cost him the daughter who had been his quietest ally. And for once, the thought didn't make me ache. It made me stronger. Because I wasn't chasing reconciliation anymore. I wasn't chasing scraps of love from people who had only ever fed off me. I was done waiting for them to change. Tonight was the first night I understood that I didn't need their table, their approval, their twisted version of family. I had built my own strength, and now I carried the power of truth in my hands. They had called me a leech, a burden, a disappointment. But in reality, I was the one who held the receipts, the proof, the leverage. And when the moment came, whether I chose to use it tomorrow or years from now, it would be me, not them, who decided how this story ended. That realization spread through me like fire, steady and consuming, and for the first time in my life, I felt untouchable. I drove until the horizon began to pale with the first hint of dawn, the sky softening from black to gray, and in that fragile light I felt something inside me shift forever. The woman who had walked into that dining room carrying gifts, desperate for belonging, had been buried the moment my mother spat out those words. In her place rose someone else, someone who didn't flinch at silence, who didn't tremble at rejection, who no longer mistook cruelty for love. I thought back to every Christmas, every birthday, every milestone that had been dimmed by their disdain, and for the first time those memories didn't sting. They clarified. They were proof that I had been surviving in a family that only knew how to take, and the fact that I was still standing meant I was stronger than they ever wanted me to realize. The irony was sharp, almost poetic. They had cast me out to hurt me, but in truth they had set me free. And in my freedom I carried the one thing they feared most, the evidence of who they really were, tucked safely away where their hands could never reach it. Whether I chose to expose them or keep it as my quiet weapon, it no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had reclaimed the narrative they had stolen. I wasn't a leech. I wasn't weak. I wasn't the burden they had painted me to be. I was the ledger they couldn't balance, the truth they couldn't silence, the daughter they couldn't destroy. As the sun began to climb, casting golden light across the windshield, I whispered into the morning air, steady and unshaken, "You'll never feed on me again." And in that moment, I knew the story was no longer about them. It was about me, finally stepping out of their shadows, carrying my own power, writing my own ending. They would go on spinning lies, pretending to be the family they never were. But deep down, they would always wonder when the silence would break, when the truth would surface, when the daughter they dismissed would become the one who defined them. That was my revenge. Not in fire, not in fury, but in freedom. And as I drove toward the sunrise, I understood that leaving wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning.